Laurel, Maryland, a suburban community between Baltimore and Washington, D.C.
Laurel still has a small town, kind of a Mayberry-like feel to it. Everybody knows everybody.
Ann Donnelly, who is a private care nurse, is reporting for duty. Her charge is a 26-year-old Jasmine Gilbert, who suffers from cerebral palsy.
Hello? Ann? Hello?
This is extremely unusual. She expects to be greeted as she usually is. Oh, good morning, Anne. But the place is quiet, very, very quiet.
Hello? Hello?
She goes to the back door, the patio door.
Tina?
The door's unlocked.
James? Tina?
And no one answers her calls.
James?
And then she was the one that found the bodies and found this horrific, bloody scene in the bedroom.
When first responders arrive, they walk into a monstrous scene. Jasmine's mother, 45-year-old Tina Towler, is dead on the bedroom floor, along with 42-year-old James Ferguson.
The bedroom is chaos, and back tucked off beyond the bed is another bed with covers.
And that's when they discovered Jasmine Gilbert.
I've been with the Prince George's County Police since 2007. This was my second homicide case. The first case I got was, we closed it within 48 hours. It wasn't a difficult case. So I told my sergeant that I wanted more of a challenge. He said, "Be careful for what you ask for." It was a nice spring morning. I was driving into work. It was just after 8 in the morning.
Dispatch to Detective Bellino.
Go for Bellino. And they called me and said that there had been 2 bodies found at a residence in Laurel. When it comes to investigating a case, I want to live and die by my own hand. So for me, getting to the scene of the crime and to be involved in the decisions is essential.
Detective Bellino is informed there is the 26-year-old cerebral palsy patient who is apparently unharmed. There's no visible injury to this girl, but they still had her removed to be medically examined. But her mother, Tina Towler, and her boyfriend, James Ferguson, are dead on the bedroom floor.
Tina and I were best friends. My husband and I end up moving into the same neighborhood, and that's probably how our friendship evolved. We would bring the kids together, do cookies for Christmas time. I taught her how to drive a stick shift.
James had a large and very dynamic family. Everybody described somebody who was just fun to be around, just a good person to hang out with, somebody who would always welcome you into his apartment at any time.
When you initially enter the apartment, there was a living space, dining room table, kitchen. There was several beer cans that were on the coffee table. Outside of that, everything appeared in order. There was no signs of a struggle. Once you got inside the bedroom, you could see that a serious altercation had occurred there.
This is a very violent crime scene, blood spatter on the walls, on the floor, a great deal of blood every place.
I noticed the door to the bedroom was damaged where the lock would be.
So the thought was that somebody kicked in that bedroom door. We could see blood spatter on the ceiling and just the brutal nature of the attacks on both of them.
There were pots, there were pans, there was a vase that was shattered, broken on either sides of the bedroom.
Must have been one hell of a struggle.
And then there were these two bodies. Tina was found at the foot of the bed. She had multiple stab wounds to her back, the lower back area. Her face had been heavily beaten.
And he is immediately struck by something very unusual.
She had the imprint of what looked like EVE on her forehead.
One of the first images I remember that will never leave my mind is looking at Tina's body and to see the letters imprinted on her forehead.
That's a critical piece of evidence. Now, what does that mean? Next to her on the floor, flat on his back, is James Ferguson.
He had multiple sharp force injuries, stab wounds to his hands and chest, upper body.
He's also wearing a leather pouch on his belt, the type that's worn that contains a knife. The pouch is empty and the snap closure is open. So did that knife somehow become involved in this offense?
When you have a boyfriend, girlfriend dead in a home or in a residence, I mean, you always have to examine whether it's a possibility it's a murder-suicide.
But Bellino looks at these bodies and notices immediately that can't be true. Mr. Ferguson has extreme blunt trauma injuries to his face. He didn't beat himself up. Tina Tyler has the same thing. They were both attacked by someone else. This is a double homicide.
I've never seen a case like that. This was a horrible, horrible killing.
When we continued to look through the apartment in a bathroom that was just adjacent to their bedroom, there was a knife that was unfolded that was in the sink next to a bar of soap. We also found a towel nearby.
That knife came from the sheath that's carried on Mr. Ferguson's waist. Did he pull that knife to try to defend himself and it was taken away from him and then used against him? It's likely that's true.
The problem is that in any bathroom, and in this one, there's soap, there's water, and there is a way for that evidence to then be disinfected, cleaned, and then sent down the drain and destroyed.
There is nothing apparently missing, no ransacking in the other rooms, no open drawers, no search through purses, none of that. The purpose of this event is murder, nothing else.
The victims, 45-year-old Tina Tyler and her boyfriend, 42-year-old James Ferguson, found beaten and stabbed to death in the bedroom of their apartment in Laurel. Police say they found no sign of forced entry.
The victim's daughter wasn't hurt. She is a witness to the crime, and she is now in the care and custody of the state of Maryland.
We hear about murders all the time, in the state and in the region. The fact that her daughter was there and witnessed it and, in her physical condition and really put a tragic, sad twist on the whole thing.
When Jasmine was born, she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy and given 3 months to live. Obviously, at the time of this double homicide, she had outlived those expectations.
Unfortunately, Jasmine has a very severe form of cerebral palsy. Ultimately, it results in a person who is incapable of walking, standing, sitting. It is a terrible disease. Nurse Ann Donnelly is there at the hospital and says she's fine, she's not hurt.
Ann Donnelly and the other nurses were a select group of women who had cared for her for a long period of time.
So they had an afternoon nurse until 9:30 or so at night. And then the first thing the next morning, they would have a day nurse that would come in. So between 9:30 p.m. and 8 a.m. is the time this crime occurred.
I can't imagine what she went through.
Definitely, the trauma doesn't just stop, with the witnessing of the horrific event, not, knowing why you're being taken out of your home and then put in this hospital, not knowing who these doctors and nurses are. It could cause even more stress for her.
He asked, "Do you think she can understand me if I ask her something?" Donnelly says, "I don't think so. You can try. This child is nonverbal."
But she connects in other ways.
Yes.
She knows voices, so if you go in and you say, "Hey, Jazz, how you doing?" and she would smile and she would start to laugh. She just loved music. Tina sang to her a lot, so she liked for her mom to sing to her.
Because she was in that room and it was evident that this all took place right there in front of her. So what did she know? Our goal was to try to figure out, what did she see?
Jazzy, honey, it's Ann. You're in the hospital. Jazzy, honey.
It was always in the back of my mind, how had this affected her? Would she be able to communicate?
The only person who saw or potentially saw anything is Jasmine. So it's critical that Bellino makes every attempt to try to get information from her. She is the ultimate loose end.
Tina Towler and her boyfriend, James Ferguson, were found beaten and stabbed to death in their bedroom after a home nurse arrived to care for Towler's severely disabled daughter, Jasmine.
The daughter was in a location where it would be reasonable that she would have been either had witnessed the homicide or a portion thereof.
We know Jasmine was in the room when both James and Tina were murdered, and our goal was to try to figure out, what did she see? What does she know about it?
Jazzy, honey, you're safe now, okay? This nice man wants to ask you some questions.
But does she understand what she's being asked? An eyewitness certainly can be extremely useful. As a cerebral palsy patient in terrible physical condition, how useful that may be remains to be seen.
Jazzy, we have to know what happened last night. Did you see who hurt your mom?
It's disappointing to know that somebody who was present during the crime is not going to be able to give us information that we really need.
I'm sorry. I just don't think she understands.
Let's just let her rest for now. I can come back later.
The fact that Jasmine was left alive was an indicator to us that the individual who killed James and Tina knew of her condition and did not kill her because they knew that she would never be able to tell. Obviously, we had a large contingent of officers who assisted with the neighborhood canvass to knock on doors, speak to all the neighbors. And from speaking to witnesses in the case, we learned that Jay Towler is Tina Towler's ex-husband.
The officer says he spoke to a neighbor who noticed that the ex-husband was standing in the crowd outside the crime scene. Now, that's kind of odd. Why did you not contact the police if you're concerned about the victim? So Jay Towler is invited to come for an interview at the police department.
Anytime you have a crime like this, you have a woman who's murdered, you have her boyfriend who's murdered, there's a potential that this could be some type of love triangle gone bad.
One of Jasmine's nurses called and said that Mr. James and Miss Tina are unresponsive. So I told my boss I had to go, and I left. You couldn't get close. They had it all blocked off. Just a lot of people around, cameras, TV cameras, and so forth. Policeman said, well, we're gonna take you down and have some questions for you down at the police station.
When the crime is wide open, everybody's a suspect. I certainly interviewed him that way.
So you were not in the apartment last night?
No, I already told you.
I told the detective I wouldn't do nothing like that. It was like Mike Tyson hit me in my stomach. I was crushed.
He seemed to be truly emotional and distraught over her death and came off as somebody who wanted to be helpful in any way he could.
I met Tina on the subway, and she was struggling with Jasmine. I gave her a hand with Jasmine, and we kind of talked a little bit and got her number and so forth, and eventually we got together. Got married later on.
Me, Tina, Jay, and my husband, we started taking vacations together, so we did cruises. The families kind of just kind of merged.
So he asked Tyler to explain to him what caused their marriage to break up.
But we had a child, Michael. Michael, at 2 years old, he was diagnosed with hepatoblastoma, and he passed at 3 years old.
And the sudden death of their child, it kind of changed the trajectory of her life and their marriage.
Mr. Tyler explained that she was overwhelmed emotionally, and they drifted apart as a result.
Maybe we couldn't live together. That didn't mean we didn't care for each other. I always would check on her and Jasmine. You know what I mean?
He had no hatred toward her. They just didn't want to be married anymore, and they got unmarried. Well, we have a second victim in this house. What do you say about Mr. Ferguson?
James, he seemed like a decent person. We got along real well. And, you know, he would call me up, Jay, come on over. I got dinner. Come on over.
So there was no animosity toward his ex-wife or toward James Ferguson. We still want to alibi him. Where were you on the night this occurred?
I was at my regular job. I went and fixed the bathroom up in Gettysburg, and I was home after that.
He told me that he'd gotten home that evening, probably 9, 10 o'clock. He stayed there at the apartment, watched some TV, and went to sleep.
You know, I didn't have no girlfriend at the house and nothing like that. And so I'm thinking now, like, wow, this isn't a good alibi. But it's the truth.
When I asked him for somebody who could verify his whereabouts, he said that Thurston Yerby, his roommate, would be able to verify that he, in fact, was at home that evening.
Mr. Yerby? I'm calling in reference to Jay Towler. Is there any way you can come down to the station this afternoon?
When I initially spoke with Thurston, he had left the Laurel area and had gone to North Carolina with his girlfriend to visit some of her relatives.
And he confirms Mr. Tyler's alibi, that he was home that night. He remembers him coming home and he never left. And Thurston Yerby further said he'd be happy to come down and make a written statement to that effect when he returns from his trip.
Just an over-the-phone confirmation isn't enough. Detective Bellino's thorough in what he does. He needs to have you in. He needs to have you interviewed.
Hey, the ME called. They're ready for you.
You know, I always say, I've seen enough death. I'll be fine if I don't see any more. There's no way for us to escape that real intimate exposure to death that you have when you're in an autopsy. It's important that you or somebody you work with goes.
So, what'd you find?
Well, they both have alcohol in their systems. I haven't seen anything this brutal in a long time.
James Ferguson's cause of death were blunt force injuries and multiple stabbing/cutting wounds. I think he had somewhere near 15.
The coroner also told Bellino that the knife found in the bathroom sink, the folding knife from the sheath or pouch on James Ferguson's waist, is consistent with all of the wounds and therefore is likely the murder weapon.
Tina Towler's cause of death was multiple injuries, mainly because there were so many different things that were done to her. Blunt force injuries, stabbing and cutting wounds, and then the attempted asphyxiation as well.
It takes a certain type of, individual to strangle somebody, to have that type of close, intimate contact.
This level of violence is not exhibited by a stranger versus another stranger. This is someone who knows them, who hates them. But who's the intended victim here?
What do you make of that?
There is a word on the forehead of the victim, EVE.
It was an indicator to us that extreme force had been used to kill her.
Wait a minute. I know what this is.
The victims, 45-year-old Tina Lynn Towler and 42-year-old James Bell Ferguson, lived together in the apartment. Detectives recovered multiple murder weapons from the scene, including household items and a knife. The exact motive for these murders is still unknown.
When Bellino meets with a medical examiner, he sees a mark on the forehead that is actually a word. It's EVE.
And we were able to determine that those letters were on a flashlight that was broken and found on the scene of the crime.
And it was an ever-ready flashlight. She was so savagely beaten with that flashlight that part of the name of the light was transferred to her forehead.
The fact that she had all these blunt force injuries to her face, to me, it was overkill. Whatever happened to her was excessive.
What it shows is that the focus of the assault was probably primarily on Tina Towler.
What was really striking about this particular case is the multiple instruments that are used. The knife, the flashlight, the vase, the frying pan, the pots. This is somebody who is clearly acting in rage at that point. He's determined to not just kill them, but seriously kill them.
At that point, there wasn't any one piece of evidence that gave us a solid lead that would clearly identify who was responsible for this.
There's always dead ends in murder cases, and people think that's frustrating, but by the same token, you're eliminating what didn't happen. It allows you to focus on what did happen.
At that point, the only eyewitness was Tina's adult daughter, Jasmine.
Early on, I was informed that Jasmine was non-communicative, but I started to explore the possibility that there are other individuals who don't speak traditionally as we do, but are able to communicate in other ways.
Bellino did a lot of research before he attempted to contact Jasmine again. He looked at medical research. He talked to a team of people who are familiar with this disease. It's still clear to Bellino this is a nearly impossible task, but he's willing to attempt it because he doesn't have another option at the moment.
I initially thought that there was a possibility that, we could get some type of nonverbal yes or no response.
At that point, she was at a home. It wasn't quite a nursing home, but they took care of adults with various disabilities.
Last week in the river. Full report coming up later. The benefits of laughter. It's no secret that laughter makes.
Hi, Jasmine. I'm Detective Bellino.
She smiled. She gave signs of recognition to the nurses when they entered the room, and I attempted to talk to her.
So somebody was in your room that night. Somebody hurt your mom and James real bad. I think you saw what happened.
I looked at her eyes. I looked at her hands, her head, to just see if I could in any way get her to respond or acknowledge that she understood the information I was trying to relay to her.
Do you know who was in your room that night? Jasmine, do you know who killed your mom? Jasmine.
From everything that I could gather, she was not understanding any of the information I was attempting to present to her.
Thank you, Jasmine.
There was no indication that she had any idea what he was talking about. Bellino was forced to reach the conclusion that he no longer had an eyewitness. Jasmine was incapable of providing him with any information whatsoever. So the case proceeds as if she wasn't even in the room. We need a fresh look at this. Forget what's happened so far and start over.
When your case kind of reaches an impasse, a lot of times detectives will go back out and recanvass the area, and not just for evidence, but also knocking on doors to see who might have seen or heard anything.
You don't always find everybody the first time. You contact every door again, see what happens.
Is this about the murders the other night?
I spoke with a resident of the building who was able to give me some information about the night that James and Tina were murdered.
And suddenly, a second canvas has produced potentially a very valuable witness. She says that when she comes home from work the night of the murders, it was almost 11 o'clock at night.
She said that there was a large white SUV that was outside the victim's apartment. She hadn't seen it there before, and there was a male sitting behind the wheel with a baseball cap on, smoking a cigarette.
He's within the time frame of when the murders occurred, whoever he may be. So what is he doing? Waiting for people to go to bed so he can kill them? We don't know.
Thanks for your time. That's all we need.
We just thought it was unusual and suspicious.
Bellino's next move is to check in with the forensics team.
DNA evidence was vital. It's essential in us being able to identify the killer.
Found some things you might be interested in.
And one thing that's of particular interest is a garbage can found in Tina's kitchen.
There were several beer cans inside that trash can. And then underneath what looked like a large white disposable cloth, it turned out to be like a nurse's smock.
That's the evening nurse throwing it away when she left at 9:30.
Those beer cans that were on top of the smock were placed there after she had left. Some of the beer cans were compared and determined to have the DNA of James Ferguson, but there were other cans that had the DNA of an unknown individual.
It's important that we recover DNA from everybody involved or potentially involved in this crime. Jay Tyler has asked for a DNA sample, which he freely offers.
I knew my DNA and stuff was there because I'm there every day checking on them, but I give it to you anyway. I mean, I don't have nothing to hide.
So he provided a DNA sample. The one last thing that we had to do to truly eliminate him was to interview an alibi witness. That person was Thurston Yerby.
Thanks for coming in, Mr.
So Thurston Yerby drove to the police station, came and met with me. He was an electrician who worked with Jay Towler. Because of their work together in home remodeling, they decided to get an apartment together.
And he confirms Mr. Towler's alibi. He remembers him coming home and he never left.
Do you mind if we get a DNA sample?
I asked Thurston if he was willing to submit a sample of DNA for the purpose of elimination. I wasn't even certain that I was going to take it because he's just an alibi witness, but I wanted to see his response.
It's not going to be a problem, is it?
You're going to have to talk to my lawyer about that.
When a witness tells you they're not willing to give a DNA sample, it raises red flags.
Bellino knows this is something to pay attention to because he's reacting. The hair is standing up on the back of his neck.
He started to get uncomfortable, and I could tell he was nervous.
Is there any reason for your DNA or fingerprints to be inside Miss Towler's apartment?
Nope.
Want one?
So Bellino uses a standard technique. He offers him a bottle of water. And he takes a drink. If he leaves that behind, it's abandoned property, and they can test it for DNA and use it in court.
You mind?
Yeah, why don't we go outside?
When Yerby leaves, he takes that bottle with him, puts the cap on it, and sticks it in his pocket.
I had never seen that, where a suspect understands and knows that they may be leaving DNA behind, and then carries their trash in their pocket outside. While we were outside, I continued to converse with him.
He said Jay Towler was a contractor, and there were occasions where he would hire James Ferguson as well as Thurston Yerby to do some work for him in his contracting business.
So Thurston knew and was friendly with at least one, if not both, of the victims.
So you knew Tina and James through your roommate Jay, but you hadn't been in the apartment recently?
That's right.
And I'm watching him smoke this cigarette all the way down to the last bit of tobacco.
Bellino is anxious to get his hands on the cigarette butt.
He then stuck the butt in his pocket. And I thought that this is very unusual.
He's leaving no trail behind him. He's been coached by someone on how DNA can be obtained, and he makes certain that the two objects that contain it, he's taking with him. That makes Thurston Yerby a prime suspect. But there's not enough there to lock him up. Not yet. So now it's a hurry-up mode. Now the chase begins. They've got to get to people before Yerby does.
Detective Bellino starts having people look into the background of Mr. Yerby and people that knew him.
Could tell he likes to party.
I don't know. Moody, I guess.
You guys talking about that murder?
Why do you ask?
Because I'm pretty sure he had a thing with that dead lady.
What?
We came across and spoke with another witness who suspected that Thurston had had an affair with Tina. They had gone to a hotel room several months prior and had seen Thurston in a hotel room with Tina Towler in bed under the sheets.
And her boyfriend, James Ferguson, didn't know. Well, now, isn't that interesting? So this is certainly something Bellino has not heard. That Tina Towler now has a perchance romantic involvement with Thurston Yerby.
It was a big break in the case. The fact that someone we were just speaking with as an alibi witness that was now being uncovered was in fact having a sexual relationship or an affair with our victim. So that was huge. Sam said that on the night of James and Tina's murder, Thurston Yerby was at a party. He was intoxicated.
Thurston Yerby was so out of control, drinking alcohol and using cocaine, that he was groping all the women at this party and got thrown out.
What's the matter with you, man?
Who's this?
Hey, man, go home and sleep it off.
The night's still young. I'm going to get laid.
Maybe he's talking about going to see Tina. Not only is he drunk, his system is full of cocaine, which makes him superhuman in terms of strength and in terms of volatility.
Do you remember what kind of car Mr. Yerby was driving that night?
Yeah, it was a big SUV.
Color?
White.
You're positive?
100%.
Basically, you can hear the ding, ding, ding. Everything's fitting together. So Detective Bellino pretty easily learns that Mr. Yerby's girlfriend owns a white SUV, and Mr. Yerby drove that SUV frequently.
So it's all starting to come together, but Bellino still does not have Yerby's DNA. And he can't get it without his consent at this point. But he does have his fingerprints because he has a record.
Detective Bellino looks into the evidence that was collected back in the house and determines that the beer can that came out of the trash can has fingerprints on it.
What do you know?
The fingerprints recovered from the beer cans were identified to be those of Thurston Lamont Yerby. proves that he was inside the residence after the time that the nurses had left. While he had told us and told me he had never been inside the residence, that was a lie, and that he was the last person who was inside that home before the victims were murdered.
Now, we can't ask the judge to order him to give his DNA. The judge says, you're hereby commanded to get the DNA sample of Mr. Thurston Yerby.
Or as they say in Ireland, you're DNA doesn't lie. DNA isn't influenced, and DNA isn't interpreted. It either matches or it doesn't. And if it matches, Mr. Yerby has something he cannot explain. After a protracted investigation of the deaths of James Ferguson and Tina Towler, Detective Bellino has arrived at a prime suspect, Thurston Yerby.
We were able to get a warrant to obtain a sample of his DNA to compare it against evidence in the scene of the crime.
Go down to the seat right here, sir. All right, open your mouth, please, sir.
What if I don't?
Mr. Yerby is cocky and confrontive. It's like he's saying, catch me if you can. He believes he's smarter than the police, and he comes across that way.
Ready?
Yes, sir, you're free to go. Don't leave town.
Bellino releases him pending the results of the DNA examination.
14 out of 15 alleles. It's about as clear as it gets.
So this is a match?
It's a match.
Thurston Yerby's DNA is on the bloody towel in the bathroom, along with both victims' DNAs. His DNA is on the murder weapon, and his DNA is on the beer can in the trash can. Thurston can deny all he wants. The evidence is overwhelming, and it says otherwise.
He was the culprit involved in these murders.
When they finally have their warrant in hand, Yerby understands he's being looked for.
He's on the move.
He knows they'll find that evidence, particularly after they took that DNA sample. So he's a little elusive at the moment.
We need to get him in custody. We didn't want a high-speed chase or some type of incident that would further danger the community.
He just pulled into the elementary school.
They find him at the school where his girlfriend works.
It's definitely a dangerous situation. He is bringing himself and stopping at a location that has large amounts of small children.
If he moves, they're going to follow him away from the school, stop him, and arrest him. But they want those kids out of there and gone before they try anything. And they do. They wait, and the kids come out. The kids leave the area. He's still sitting there. I don't know what he's doing there, but that's where he is.
Let's move.
Driver, show me your hands. Put your hands out. Step out and face away from me. Walk backwards. Stop. Lay down on your face.
Thurston Yerby, you have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent...
We were fortunately able to get him in custody without anyone really becoming too aware of it.
But he says, in his same cocky, I know everything manner, you got one chance to convict me, and if you don't, I'm walking.
The suspect wanted for the murders of a couple in Laurel is now in police custody. The Prince George's County Police Department obtained a warrant on Wednesday charging 47-year-old Thurston Lamont Yerby of Laurel with first-degree murder.
There is a sense of satisfaction when you solve a case like this, and the detectives put a lot of hard work into this case, and it's very satisfying.
What I believe happened that night is Thurston Yerby wanted to have sex that evening.
He had had a relationship with Tina Towler at one point before, and he went by the house because he had been there before and he knew where it was.
What are you doing here?
Hey, baby.
Hey, man. Long time no see.
Hey, what's going on, bro?
Huh, nothing. Come on in, have a drink.
And it seems that Tina Towler and James Ferguson may have let him come in.
I believe that he drank beer with James Ferguson and played it off as if he was there just to socially spend time and hang out.
It looks like at some point when James Ferguson went into the bathroom that Thurston Yerby attempted to take advantage of that time.
I'm gonna go check on Jasmine.
What the hell are you doing?
James Ferguson probably pulled out the knife that he carries on his belt, and Thurston Yerby, who was stronger and bigger than James Ferguson, disarmed him, killed James Ferguson, stabbed him to death, and then realized that he could not leave a witness. So after killing James, he decided to kill Tina.
No, please don't!
In my opinion, Thurston Yerby pulled that sheet over Jasmine's head so she couldn't see what was happening.
Thurston Yerby went to the bathroom, cleaned himself up, cleaned off as much of the blood as he could, and decided not to kill Jasmine because he knew that Jasmine was never going to be able to communicate. Got in his vehicle and left.
So I argue very passionately to the jury because I still believe to this day it was premeditated. But at some point, as he's beating them, stabbing them, choking them, at some point he's aware he's killing them. And he goes into the kitchen to get pans and pots. He's going to get more weapons and coming back. Why is he getting these weapons? To kill them. That's premeditation.
What went wrong in that apartment to go from drinking beer to stabbing and bludgeoning everyone to death? We're not going to know that. It's speculation. Mr. Yerby isn't going to tell us.
Thurston Yerby was convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder. He's serving 2 30-year sentences consecutively at Jessup Correctional Institution.
My brother would look out and help anyone. As far as I know, he's very respectful. And he's going to be truly, gratefully missed.
I want to remember Tina as the person that I knew her as. The sweet, bubbly, loving, caring, giving person.
I know that Tina wanted to be with Michael, so hopefully that's where she got to, because that was her heart.
So there are many tragedies to this case. Probably one of the things that lingers with me so many years later, not just the savagery what happened to Tina and James.
I used to think the most frightening crimes began with a scream. A shattered window. A desperate call to emergency services. A stranger lurking in the darkness. But some stories refuse to follow the rules we expect. Some begin under ordinary streetlights, with quiet conversation, polite smiles, and the kind of evening that disappears into memory before anyone realizes it will become history. This is one of those stories. It is a story that forces an unsettling question long before it asks who committed the crime. The identity of the killer would eventually become undeniable. The evidence would be overwhelming. The confession would come. Yet none of those answers would silence the question that echoed through courtrooms, government offices, and one grieving family for years afterward. How does a man with decades of violent convictions, a man repeatedly identified as posing an extraordinary risk to women, end up walking freely through an English city until he crosses paths with someone who should never have become another name on his list of victims? In the ancient cathedral city of Winchester, history seemed to linger in every stone wall and every narrow street. Tourists wandered past medieval buildings, church bells marked the passing hours, and local pubs filled with familiar faces who rarely imagined their quiet routines would one day be dissected in national headlines. It was the kind of place where strangers did not remain strangers for long, where neighbors recognized one another, where parents believed they knew which roads were safe after sunset. Nothing about Winchester suggested it would become the backdrop for one of Britain's most disturbing failures to protect the public. Nothing about that August evening suggested that an ordinary conversation would end with irreversible tragedy. Naomi Bryant was not famous. She was not wealthy. She was not living a dangerous life or seeking unnecessary risks. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, a woman with responsibilities waiting for her the next morning, and a teenage daughter who expected nothing more unusual than seeing her mother come home. Like countless people across Britain every single day, she stepped out expecting an evening that would fade quietly into yesterday. She could not possibly know that every ordinary choice she made during those hours would later be examined with impossible precision. Every street she walked, every minute on the clock, every conversation, every glance, every witness, every decision reconstructed by investigators searching for the moment when fate quietly changed direction. Yet even that reconstruction tells only half the story. Because this crime did not truly begin on the evening Naomi Bryant met Anthony Rice. It had begun years earlier, inside prison walls, inside probation reports, inside psychological assessments, inside confidential meetings where experienced professionals repeatedly warned that one man continued to present an exceptional danger. Those warnings existed. Those records existed. Those convictions existed. The system knew exactly who Anthony Rice was. Long before Naomi Bryant ever heard his name, officials had already spent decades documenting the violence that followed him. They knew about the women whose lives he had already shattered. They knew about the escalating pattern of sexual violence. They knew about the manipulation. They knew about the aggression. They knew that previous punishments had failed to change his behavior. They knew experts remained deeply concerned about the possibility that he would attack again if released. The files grew thicker. The warnings became clearer. Yet somehow, despite everything contained within those pages, a different decision emerged. A decision built on assessments, procedures, professional judgment, and confidence that the risk could be managed. It was not one mistake made by one careless individual. It was something more complicated and therefore far more unsettling. Layers of institutions, each believing another layer had done enough. Reviews completed. Boxes checked. Meetings held. Conditions imposed. Supervision arranged. On paper, everything appeared organized. Reality would expose something very different. 9 months. That was all it took. 9 months separated Anthony Rice's release from the death that would transform a private tragedy into a national reckoning. 9 months during which opportunities existed to recognize warning signs. 9 months during which responsibility passed between agencies. 9 months during which a dangerous man continued living among ordinary people who had absolutely no idea who they were encountering. Imagine walking past someone on the pavement without knowing that shelves filled with confidential reports describe him as one of the highest risk offenders in the country. Imagine sharing a drink with someone whose past remains invisible because the institutions responsible for containing that danger believe they have already done enough. Most people trust that certain decisions have already been made carefully by professionals. We assume that those judged too dangerous to release will remain behind secure doors until the danger has genuinely changed. That trust is woven quietly into everyday life. We cross streets, enter restaurants, meet new acquaintances, and believe that the systems designed to protect society are functioning in the background. Most of the time, they are. Sometimes, they are not. When they fail, the consequences are measured not only in reports or public inquiries but in empty chairs at family tables, birthdays that become anniversaries of grief, and children forced to grow up with memories instead of parents. Naomi Bryant's daughter would never again experience an ordinary evening with her mother. That simple reality remains the heaviest truth within this case. It is easy, years later, to become absorbed by legal arguments, institutional failures, and the disturbing biography of Anthony Rice. Those subjects matter because they explain how events unfolded. But before any discussion of policies or prison procedures, there was a family whose future divided permanently into before and after. Before August 2005, Naomi was simply part of everyday life. After August 2005, every memory carried unbearable weight. Across Britain, newspapers quickly focused on the shocking background of the man responsible. Headlines questioned how someone with such an extensive history of violent offending could ever have been released. Television debates demanded accountability. Politicians promised answers. Investigations began almost immediately. Yet behind every public controversy stood something painfully personal. A daughter waiting for explanations no official report could truly provide. Parents struggling to understand why warnings had not prevented disaster. Friends replaying familiar conversations, wondering whether anything could have changed the outcome. There is another reason this case continues to be studied today. It is not remembered solely because of its brutality. Sadly, history contains many terrible murders. This one endures because it exposed something that reached beyond one offender and one victim. It forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable possibility that dangerous failures are rarely dramatic in the moment they occur. They accumulate quietly through assumptions, communication gaps, misplaced confidence, and decisions that appear reasonable until tragedy reveals their consequences. No single document announced that catastrophe was inevitable. No single official intended harm. Yet the final result remained exactly the same. A woman lost her life. A family lost someone they loved. Public confidence fractured. The justice system was forced to examine not merely what happened after the murder but what happened long before it. That is where this story truly begins. Not with flashing police lights. Not with courtroom verdicts. Not with sensational headlines. It begins inside forgotten offices, overlooked warnings, and ordinary decisions made by people who believed they were managing an extraordinary risk. Because by the time Anthony Rice met Naomi Bryant, the most important choices had already been made. The encounter that changed everything lasted only hours. The chain of decisions that made it possible had stretched across decades. And somewhere within that chain lies the question that still refuses to disappear. Was this tragedy simply unavoidable, or had the warning signs been visible all along, waiting for someone to take them seriously before one ordinary August evening became a moment that would forever alter countless lives? The tragedy that unfolded in Winchester would eventually be described in newspapers as a murder case. Lawyers would reduce it to evidence, timelines, witness statements, and legal arguments. Government reports would examine policies, procedures, and failures inside institutions entrusted with protecting the public. Statisticians would count it among homicide cases. Historians of criminal justice would later point to it as a catalyst for reform. But for those who lived through it, none of those descriptions captured the true weight of what had happened. Because this was never just the story of a crime. It was the story of trust placed in systems that quietly broke under pressure. It was the story of warnings that existed long before the headlines. It was the story of a family whose ordinary life ended without warning. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it was the story of a man who had spent years convincing professionals that he could safely return to society while carrying within him the same violent patterns that had defined much of his adult life. There is an instinct most of us share when we hear about violent crime. We look for distance. We search for the detail that allows us to believe the victim lived a life unlike our own or made choices we ourselves would never make. We tell ourselves that danger belongs somewhere else, to someone else, under different circumstances. That instinct offers comfort because it creates the illusion of control. But some cases refuse to give us that comfort. Naomi Bryant's story is one of them. Nothing about her evening suggested she was stepping into extraordinary danger. She was not walking through abandoned streets at midnight. She was not involved in organized crime. She was not running from anyone or hiding a dangerous secret. She was living an ordinary life in an ordinary English city, making ordinary decisions that millions of people make every day without consequence. That ordinary quality is precisely what makes this case endure. It forces an uncomfortable realization that sometimes the greatest danger is not the one we can see. Sometimes it is hidden behind official decisions, invisible paperwork, and institutional confidence that everything is under control. Long before Naomi Bryant ever crossed paths with Anthony Rice, there were countless opportunities for history to take a different direction. Imagine a shelf filled with thick files, each one documenting another conviction, another act of violence, another assessment warning that the risk remained exceptionally high. Imagine meetings where experienced professionals debated whether one individual could ever safely return to public life. Imagine reports written in careful language, each sentence carrying enormous consequences for people who would never read them. Those documents were not predictions of a specific victim or a specific date. They were something perhaps even more troubling. They were repeated acknowledgments that the possibility of future violence remained frighteningly real. Yet societies built on justice face a difficult question. How long should someone remain imprisoned? Can rehabilitation ever outweigh a history of repeated violence? When does punishment end and supervised freedom begin? Democracies cannot answer those questions through fear alone. They rely on assessments, evidence, expert judgment, and legal safeguards. Those principles exist for good reason. They protect everyone from arbitrary power. But they also demand extraordinary accuracy when dealing with offenders whose histories suggest that another failure could cost an innocent life. The story you are about to hear is not an argument against justice. It is an examination of what happens when judgment proves catastrophically wrong. Anthony Rice did not emerge from nowhere. He did not suddenly become violent in August 2005. His past stretched back decades, marked by repeated convictions involving violence against women, behavior that investigators, psychologists, prison officials, and probation officers had studied extensively. He was known, documented, evaluated, discussed, reviewed. There was nothing mysterious about his history. If anything, its consistency was what made it so alarming. That history should have acted like a warning beacon visible from miles away. Instead, somewhere inside a complex network of agencies, responsibility became fragmented. Each organization fulfilled part of its role. Each decision appeared connected to another decision. Each safeguard depended on another safeguard functioning exactly as intended. On paper, the structure looked reassuring. In reality, it contained weaknesses that no one fully appreciated until it was far too late. When disaster finally arrived, investigators did not discover a single dramatic mistake waiting at the center of the case. They found something more difficult to confront. Small failures layered upon one another. Assumptions left unchallenged. Information not fully shared. Confidence exceeding certainty. Decisions that seemed reasonable in isolation but devastating when viewed together. This is often how institutional failure unfolds. Not with obvious negligence. Not with deliberate cruelty. But with ordinary people making extraordinary decisions while believing someone else has already addressed the greatest risks. That realization transformed Naomi Bryant's death into something larger than one criminal prosecution. It became a national examination of accountability. Years later, legal experts would still discuss the case. Criminal justice professionals would study it during training. Government agencies would revise procedures because of lessons drawn from what happened in Winchester. Entire conversations about risk assessment would reference the chain of events that followed one August evening. Yet every reform arrived too late for the person whose life had already been taken. Perhaps that is the most painful truth hidden beneath every major criminal justice failure. Improvements almost always come after irreversible loss. Policies become stronger because someone paid the highest possible price before anyone recognized the weakness. As this story unfolds, it is tempting to search immediately for villains beyond the obvious one. To assign blame to individual officials. To imagine that replacing one decision-maker would have prevented everything. Reality is rarely so simple. Systems are built by people, but systems also shape people's decisions. Procedures influence judgment. Workloads affect attention. Communication breaks down between departments. Responsibility becomes shared until no single person fully owns the outcome. By the time tragedy exposes those cracks, they have often existed for years without attracting public attention. Winchester itself knew none of this on that warm August evening. The city continued moving with the quiet rhythm that had defined it for centuries. Cafes closed their doors. Streetlights flickered on. Friends laughed over drinks inside familiar pubs. Families prepared for another ordinary night. Somewhere, children finished homework before bed. Somewhere else, neighbors exchanged brief conversations before disappearing indoors. Nothing in those everyday moments suggested that the city was about to become the center of a national conversation about justice, public protection, and institutional responsibility. That is another reason this case remains so haunting. It reminds us that history rarely announces itself before it changes direction. There are no warning sirens before ordinary evenings become unforgettable ones. No headlines arrive in advance. No one standing inside that pub on the evening of August 17, 2005, could have imagined that strangers sharing the same room would soon become connected by one of Britain's most controversial homicide cases. One woman expected tomorrow. One man carried a past that should never have been forgotten. The distance between those two realities was measured not merely in steps across a pub floor, but in decades of decisions stretching back through prisons, parole hearings, psychological evaluations, and official reports. Everything that happened next would unfold with frightening speed. But to understand why Naomi Bryant died, it is not enough to examine the final hours of her life. We must also examine the years before she ever knew Anthony Rice existed. Because sometimes the most important chapter in a murder case is not the killing itself. It is everything that made that killing possible. And before we walk the streets of Winchester, before we meet Naomi Bryant, before we reconstruct the final hours that changed countless lives forever, we have to understand the world that existed long before that August evening, a world where critical warnings had already been written. Difficult questions had already been asked, and decisions with unimaginable consequences had already been made. Only then can we begin to understand why this case is remembered not simply as the murder of Naomi Bryant, but as one of the most devastating examples of how a preventable tragedy can emerge when an entire system mistakes hope for certainty. For every notorious crime that captures public attention, there comes a moment when people ask the same question. How could this happen? It is a question that seems simple on the surface, yet the deeper investigators search, the more complicated the answer becomes. Sometimes the explanation points to a single impulsive decision. Sometimes it reveals years of careful planning. And sometimes, as in the story of Naomi Bryant, the answer is so unsettling because it cannot be confined to one person alone. It reaches beyond the individual who committed the crime and into the institutions that were meant to stand between danger and the public. There is a tendency to believe that justice begins in a courtroom. In reality, justice often begins years earlier, inside meeting rooms where officials evaluate risk, inside prisons where psychologists observe behavior, inside probation offices where files are reviewed and recommendations are written. Those places rarely attract television cameras. They rarely make newspaper headlines. Their work is quiet, procedural, and largely invisible to the public. Yet decisions made behind those closed doors can determine whether thousands of ordinary people continue living in safety or unknowingly cross paths with someone whose capacity for violence has never truly disappeared. Most of us never think about those decisions. We walk through city centers without wondering who has recently been released from prison. We sit beside strangers in cafes without asking what histories they carry. We assume that if someone has been judged too dangerous to live freely among the public, every possible precaution has been taken before that judgment changes. That assumption is not unreasonable. It is part of an invisible agreement between citizens and the institutions responsible for protecting them. We trust because we must. A society cannot function if every passerby is viewed as a potential threat. But trust, once broken, leaves behind questions that linger for generations. When Naomi Bryant's name first appeared in the news, people naturally focused on the horror of her death. As more information emerged, however, another narrative began to overshadow even the crime itself. The man responsible was not an unknown predator who had somehow escaped detection. He was someone whose violent history had been documented with extraordinary detail. Someone who had spent decades moving through courts, prisons, psychiatric evaluations, and probation supervision. Someone whom experienced professionals had repeatedly identified as presenting an exceptional risk. The public reaction shifted almost overnight. The question was no longer only, who did this? It became, why was he free to do it at all? That question echoed through Parliament, through criminal justice agencies, through newspaper editorials, and through the devastated lives of Naomi's family. It is a question that still carries uncomfortable weight today because it challenges something fundamental. Not whether crime can ever be eliminated, that would be impossible, but whether every reasonable step had truly been taken to prevent a tragedy that many would later argue should never have happened. This is not a story built around mystery. There is no hidden identity waiting to be revealed in the final chapter. There is no dramatic detective unveiling an unexpected suspect. The facts of responsibility became clear remarkably quickly. Yet certainty about guilt did not bring peace. Instead, every confirmed fact uncovered another unanswered question. Every official report seemed to expose another missed opportunity. Every investigation into the system revealed another warning that had existed before Naomi Bryant ever met Anthony Rice. That is what makes this case uniquely haunting. The ending was not hidden. The warning signs were. Or perhaps more accurately, they were visible all along, but buried beneath confidence that existing safeguards would be enough. History is filled with tragedies that appear inevitable only in hindsight. Once every document has been assembled, once every timeline has been reconstructed, the missed opportunities suddenly seem obvious. But at the time decisions are made, certainty rarely exists. Officials work with incomplete information. Professionals balance competing risks. They weigh rehabilitation against public safety. They make judgments knowing that absolute guarantees are impossible. Most of the time, those judgments pass unnoticed because nothing goes wrong. When they fail, however, the consequences become impossible to ignore. Anthony Rice represented precisely the kind of offender who forced those difficult decisions. His criminal history was not a single isolated incident followed by years of lawful behavior. It reflected repeated violence, repeated convictions, repeated concerns about his attitude toward women, and repeated assessments questioning whether the underlying risk had genuinely changed. Each conviction added another chapter to a pattern. Each prison sentence created another opportunity to understand that pattern. Each psychological evaluation attempted to answer one critical question. Could society safely trust him again? Different professionals reached different conclusions over time. Some believed risk could be managed. Others remained deeply skeptical. Those differing opinions eventually converged into one decision that altered lives forever. What makes this story particularly unsettling is how ordinary everything looked on the surface once that decision had been made. Anthony Rice was not hiding in abandoned buildings or living under a false identity. He walked public streets. He entered local businesses. He spoke with strangers. He existed within everyday life, protected not by secrecy but by anonymity. The people who passed him on the street saw only another face in the crowd. They did not see decades of criminal records. They did not see confidential assessments. They did not see the arguments that had taken place inside government offices over whether he should ever be released. To them, he was simply another man walking through Winchester. That ordinary appearance concealed extraordinary danger. Meanwhile, Naomi Bryant continued living the life she had built through years of ordinary routines. She was making plans, caring for her family, moving through familiar places that had always felt safe. Like millions of parents, much of her attention centered not on herself but on the people she loved. Her life was defined by responsibilities, relationships, and expectations for the future. Nothing about those routines suggested they were nearing an irreversible ending. Perhaps that is why this case resonates so deeply even decades later. It strips away the comforting belief that life-changing events always arrive with obvious warning. Sometimes catastrophe enters quietly. It begins with a conversation. A shared drink. A walk through familiar streets. Moments so ordinary that no one nearby notices anything unusual. Only later do those ordinary moments become the opening pages of a story that will be studied by investigators, lawyers, journalists, and historians alike. As we move forward into this case, remember that every person involved believed they were stepping into another ordinary day. Naomi Bryant expected to return home. Her daughter expected to see her again. Police officers expected another routine shift. Probation officials believed existing safeguards remained in place. The residents of Winchester continued living beneath the quiet confidence that dangerous individuals were being managed by the institutions created for exactly that purpose. None of them knew they were standing at the edge of a moment that would expose one of the most controversial failures in modern British criminal justice. Because by the time the first emergency calls were made, by the time investigators began assembling evidence, by the time newspaper presses rolled through the night printing Naomi Bryant's name across front pages, the tragedy itself was already complete. Everything that remained was an attempt to answer a question that would haunt Britain for years. Not simply how one woman lost her life, but how an entire system, built to prevent exactly this kind of outcome, allowed history to repeat itself one devastating time too many. The city of Winchester has always carried itself with quiet confidence. Long before modern England took shape, these streets had already witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the footsteps of pilgrims, and centuries of ordinary lives unfolding beneath the shadow of an ancient cathedral. Stone buildings leaned gently over narrow lanes polished smooth by generations of passing feet. Every corner seemed to whisper fragments of history, not loudly enough to demand attention, but just enough to remind visitors that time moved differently here. On a summer morning, sunlight settled softly across the old city walls, warming the pale limestone that had stood through wars, plagues, and political revolutions. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors before the first customers arrived. The smell of fresh bread drifted from neighborhood bakeries into streets where commuters carried cups of coffee toward bus stops and railway platforms. Schoolchildren laughed as they hurried through familiar shortcuts, uniforms slightly untidy after the long school holidays had begun. Pensioners paused outside cafes to exchange greetings with people they had known for years. Tourists unfolded maps, pointing toward Winchester Cathedral, eager to photograph one of England's most treasured landmarks. Nothing about the city demanded urgency. Life unfolded at a pace that rewarded patience. People recognized familiar faces. Conversations lingered. Strangers rarely stayed strangers for long. It was exactly the kind of place where many believed serious violence belonged somewhere else. Winchester was not immune to crime. No city ever truly is. There were occasional burglaries, arguments outside pubs after closing time, youthful vandalism, and the kinds of incidents that local police officers handled with steady routine. Yet compared with larger urban centers, Winchester enjoyed a reputation for safety. Families chose to settle there because it felt secure. Parents allowed their children freedoms that might seem impossible in busier cities. The rhythm of daily life was built upon a quiet assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. It was an assumption shared by thousands. Among them was a woman named Naomi Bryant. To those who knew her, Naomi was never defined by newspaper headlines or legal proceedings. Before the world learned her name through tragedy, she existed simply as herself, a daughter, a mother, a colleague, a friend. Her life was measured not by dramatic events but by ordinary responsibilities that filled one day after another. Like countless parents balancing work and family, much of her energy flowed toward caring for the people she loved. Those who crossed paths with Naomi remembered warmth before anything else. She was approachable. Easy to speak with. The kind of person capable of turning casual conversation into genuine connection without appearing to try. She carried herself without pretension, comfortable in familiar surroundings, comfortable among familiar people. For her teenage daughter, she was simply Mum. A constant presence whose reliability was woven into everyday life. The routines shared between parent and child often seem ordinary while they are happening. A reminder to tidy a bedroom. A quick conversation over breakfast. Asking about plans for the afternoon. Wondering whether homework had been finished. Promising to pick something up from the shops on the way home. These tiny moments rarely feel important in real time. Only after someone is gone do they become priceless memories replayed endlessly inside the minds of those left behind. No parent imagines that an ordinary goodbye could become the last. No child expects routine to disappear overnight. The Bryant family, like so many others, lived inside that comforting certainty. Across Winchester, August 2005 carried the familiar atmosphere of late summer. Holidaymakers filled restaurants. Pub gardens remained busy well into the evening while warm air lingered after sunset. The city seemed relaxed, almost suspended between the excitement of summer and the gradual return to everyday routines waiting just beyond the horizon. There was nothing unusual about spending an evening with friends. Nothing unusual about stopping for a drink after work. Nothing unusual about striking up a conversation with someone new. Social spaces have always depended upon an unspoken contract. People enter expecting civility. Conversation. Laughter. Perhaps companionship. Very few arrive believing that a brief encounter with a stranger could alter countless lives. That invisible trust is one of civilization's quiet foundations. Without it, ordinary social life becomes impossible. While Winchester enjoyed another peaceful summer, another story was unfolding beyond the awareness of almost everyone living there. It was not happening in cafes or shopping streets. It was unfolding inside government files, probation records, prison archives, and confidential assessments. Unlike Naomi Bryant's life, this story was defined not by ordinary routines but by decades of violence, repeated convictions, and continuing concern. Anthony Rice had spent much of his adult life moving through Britain's criminal justice system. His name meant little to members of the public. To professionals responsible for managing dangerous offenders, however, it represented something very different. Over many years, police officers, prison staff, psychologists, probation officers, and parole specialists had accumulated an extensive picture of the man. Each report added another layer. Each conviction reinforced existing fears. Each professional assessment attempted to answer a difficult question that had no perfectly certain answer. Could this individual ever safely return to society? Modern justice systems are built upon competing responsibilities. They must punish crime. They must protect the public. They must also recognize the possibility that people can change. Balancing those responsibilities is rarely simple. Every decision carries consequences. Keeping someone imprisoned indefinitely without lawful justification threatens fundamental legal principles. Releasing someone too early may place innocent people at risk. Between those competing obligations stands a network of professionals required to make judgments based upon evidence rather than certainty. Most of those judgments pass unnoticed because they never become headlines. Thousands of offenders complete sentences every year without committing further serious crimes. The public rarely hears about those cases because ordinary success attracts little attention. Only failure becomes visible. And when failure involves irreversible loss, every earlier decision is suddenly examined beneath an unforgiving light. By 2005, Anthony Rice's history was already long established. His previous convictions involving violence against women were not hidden from the authorities. His behavior had been analyzed repeatedly. His risk had been discussed repeatedly. His future had been debated repeatedly. Different agencies held different pieces of the wider picture, connected through procedures designed to ensure that information moved where it was needed. On paper, the system appeared comprehensive. It relied upon structured assessments, professional communication, supervision, license conditions, regular monitoring. Each layer existed because experience had shown that dangerous offenders required more than simple release from prison. Protection depended upon constant vigilance. The public rarely noticed any of this. Nor should they have needed to. Most citizens naturally assume that these invisible systems function effectively. People do not leave home wondering whether a parole assessment has overlooked something important. They trust institutions to ask those questions on their behalf. That trust allows ordinary life to continue. Winchester itself reflected that confidence. Parents watched children cycle through quiet residential streets. Older couples strolled beside the River Itchen during warm evenings. Students gathered in parks before returning to university accommodation. Office workers stopped at familiar pubs where bartenders already knew what they would order. The city felt lived in rather than hurried. Safe rather than anxious. Predictable rather than uncertain. There was beauty in that predictability. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon drifted toward evening. Church bells echoed softly across rooftops. Traffic slowed as commuters reached home. Windows glowed with warm yellow light as families prepared dinner together. Televisions flickered behind drawn curtains. Dogs waited impatiently for evening walks. These details rarely appear in official reports because they seem too ordinary to matter. Yet they matter enormously. They represent the world that victims are living inside before violence interrupts everything. Crime never occurs in isolation. It tears through ordinary lives already full of plans, responsibilities, and relationships. It transforms familiar places into locations forever associated with grief. It changes how communities remember streets they once walked without hesitation. In August 2005, nobody in Winchester could foresee that transformation. Residents continued making plans for weekends. Businesses prepared for another day's trade. Families looked ahead toward autumn. The future still appeared comfortably ordinary. Even within the criminal justice system, few people believed they were standing on the edge of a national scandal. Reports had been written. Meetings had concluded. Decisions had been implemented. Supervision arrangements existed. From a distance, everything suggested that established procedures were functioning as intended. History would soon reveal how fragile that confidence truly was. The events that followed would challenge assumptions reaching far beyond Winchester itself. Questions would be asked inside Parliament. Independent investigations would scrutinize agencies whose work usually remained hidden from public view. Policies would be rewritten. Training would change. Professionals would revisit long-held beliefs about managing offenders assessed as presenting serious risks. But all of those developments still belonged to the future. For now, the city remained unaware. Naomi Bryant remained unaware. Her family remained unaware. Thousands of people passed one another in the streets without recognizing that two lives, moving through the same city on the same warm August days, were gradually approaching a single point where their paths would cross. One life represented ordinary hope. The other carried an extraordinary history. Between them stood an entire system convinced that sufficient safeguards were already in place. It is tempting, with the benefit of hindsight, to search this period for obvious warning signs visible to everyone. Reality is far less dramatic. Most days looked entirely normal. Most conversations sounded entirely ordinary. Nothing in the streets of Winchester suggested that one of the most significant criminal justice controversies in modern Britain was quietly approaching. That is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. History rarely announces itself before it changes direction. It often arrives disguised as another ordinary day. And in the final weeks before Naomi Bryant unknowingly entered one of Britain's most consequential true crime cases, Winchester continued to do what it had done for centuries. It woke with the morning light. It welcomed strangers. It trusted familiar routines. And it had no idea that the peace it took for granted was about to be shattered, not simply by the actions of one violent man, but by the collapse of assumptions that had quietly protected an entire community for far too long. If someone had walked through Winchester during those final days before everything changed, they would have found nothing remarkable enough to remember. The buses arrived on schedule. Shop windows displayed the first hints of autumn collections despite the lingering warmth of August. Flower baskets spilled over with bright color outside cafes, and conversations drifted easily between neighbors who had known one another for years. It was the kind of place where familiarity shaped daily life. People recognized faces more often than names, and routines created a comforting sense that tomorrow would look very much like today. That sense of normality mattered because it formed the backdrop against which every later question would be asked. When communities experience a tragedy, there is often an understandable urge to rewrite the past. People search their memories for signs that something had felt wrong. They wonder whether danger had been visible all along. Yet for the overwhelming majority of Winchester's residents, there had been no such feeling. Life continued with the quiet predictability that had earned the city its reputation as one of southern England's most welcoming places. For Naomi Bryant, those ordinary rhythms were not something she consciously appreciated every day. Like most people balancing work, family, and countless small responsibilities, she simply lived them. Morning meant preparing for the day ahead. Afternoon meant managing whatever unexpected tasks appeared. Evening offered a chance, however brief, to slow down before another day began. There was comfort in that pattern. Friends remembered her as someone who could hold an easy conversation without making it feel forced. She was approachable, someone who seemed genuinely interested in the people around her. Those qualities rarely make headlines, but they often define how a person is remembered by those who knew them best. After tragedy, it is these ordinary characteristics, not dramatic achievements, that families miss the most. A familiar smile. A reassuring voice. A message asking if everything was all right. The quiet presence of someone whose place in daily life had always seemed permanent. Loss has a way of transforming the smallest memories into the most precious ones. For Naomi's daughter, the world still revolved around the reassuring assumption that her mother would come home, that tomorrow's conversations would happen just as they always had. It is one of life's cruelest realities that we recognize the value of ordinary moments only after they can never be repeated. While Naomi's world was defined by everyday responsibilities, another reality existed almost entirely outside public view. The British criminal justice system had spent years developing increasingly sophisticated methods of assessing offenders considered capable of serious harm. Risk assessment was never intended to predict the future with certainty. Instead, it sought to evaluate patterns of behavior, past conduct, psychological factors, and the likelihood that an individual might commit further offenses. It was an enormous responsibility. Every recommendation carried consequences. A decision to continue detention affected an individual's liberty. A decision to authorize release affected public safety. Neither outcome could ever be treated lightly. By 2005, professionals working within prisons, probation services, and parole processes understood Anthony Rice's history in considerable detail. His record was neither brief nor ambiguous. It reflected years of violent offending that had repeatedly raised concern among those responsible for evaluating risk. The challenge facing the system was not a lack of information but the difficulty of interpreting what that information meant for the future. Could supervision reduce the danger? Had years in custody altered his behavior? Would strict license conditions be enough? These were questions without perfect answers. Across every modern justice system, similar decisions are made every day. Most pass without public attention because they do not result in tragedy. Successful reintegration rarely becomes national news. Failures, however, inevitably do. In hindsight, it is tempting to imagine that disaster was inevitable. History rarely feels inevitable while it is unfolding. Professionals debated evidence. Reports were reviewed. Procedures were followed according to the standards of the time. Only later would independent investigations conclude that serious shortcomings had affected the overall management of the case. Those findings would become significant not simply because they criticized individual decisions, but because they highlighted weaknesses in how different parts of the system communicated and evaluated risk. Long before those conclusions were written, however, Winchester remained entirely unaware of the debate taking place beyond public sight. The city continued living at its own unhurried pace. Children played in local parks. Office workers met friends after work. Visitors admired centuries-old architecture without realizing that history was quietly preparing to add another chapter to the city's story, one very different from the medieval landmarks that drew tourists from around the world. Perhaps that contrast is what gives this case such lasting emotional weight. Winchester symbolized continuity. Its cathedral had survived wars. Its streets had witnessed generations come and go. Life there encouraged the belief that stability could outlast uncertainty. Yet even places defined by history and tradition are not immune to modern failures. No ancient stone wall can shield a community from mistakes made within contemporary institutions. No picturesque street can prevent tragedy when critical decisions fail to achieve their purpose. Years after Naomi Bryant's death, official reviews would examine not only the actions of the offender but also the systems that existed around him. Those reviews would influence policy discussions and contribute to changes in how high-risk offenders were managed. They served as a reminder that justice is not measured solely by convictions handed down in court. It is also measured by the willingness of institutions to learn from failure, however painful that process may be. For Naomi's family, though, those broader reforms could never restore what had been taken. Public inquiries may answer procedural questions. They cannot replace birthdays missed. They cannot recreate ordinary evenings. They cannot return the reassuring certainty that existed before one ordinary day became a permanent dividing line between before and after. As our story moves forward, it is important to remember that the events to come did not unfold in isolation. They emerged from the intersection of two very different lives, one rooted in ordinary family life, the other shaped by a long and troubling history already known to the authorities. Understanding that contrast is essential, because it explains why this case would become more than a murder investigation. It would become a searching examination of responsibility, risk, and the difficult balance between rehabilitation and public protection that every justice system must confront. The questions raised in Winchester would continue long after the criminal case itself had ended, leaving a legacy that reached far beyond a single city and a single courtroom. Before her name became associated with court records, public inquiries, and newspaper headlines, Naomi Bryant belonged to a much smaller world. It was a world measured not by national attention but by everyday moments that rarely seem important until they are gone. She was known not as a victim, but as a mother, a daughter, a colleague, and a familiar face in Winchester. The people closest to her did not remember her through the circumstances of her death. They remembered conversations that stretched a little longer than planned, quiet acts of kindness that never expected recognition, and the reassuring consistency that often defines those we love most. There is a tendency in true crime stories for victims to disappear beneath the weight of the investigation. As detectives gather evidence and the public becomes fascinated by offenders, the person whose life was taken is sometimes reduced to little more than the reason an investigation exists. But every victim had a life long before the crime. They carried ambitions, worries, routines, friendships, family traditions, and countless ordinary memories that never appeared in police files. Those parts of a person's story deserve as much attention as the legal proceedings that follow. Naomi's life was rooted in responsibility. At the center of that responsibility was her teenage daughter. Parenthood is often described through milestones, birthdays, school photographs, graduations, but its true meaning is found in quieter moments. It lives in packed lunches prepared before sunrise, reminders about homework, conversations during car journeys, and the simple reassurance of knowing that someone will be home at the end of the day. Those routines become so familiar that families rarely stop to notice them. They blend into the background of everyday life, creating a sense of stability that children often take for granted until it is suddenly gone. For Naomi, motherhood was not a title she occasionally carried. It shaped the rhythm of her days. Like countless parents across Britain, she balanced her own needs against the needs of someone she loved more than herself. Decisions about time, work, and social life were never made in isolation. Somewhere in the background there was always another consideration, another responsibility waiting at home. It is impossible to fully understand the impact of her death without first understanding that relationship. When a parent dies unexpectedly, the loss extends far beyond a single life. It alters the future of an entire family. Plans are interrupted. Traditions are broken. Ordinary moments that once seemed guaranteed become memories that can never be repeated. The absence becomes permanent. Friends and acquaintances remembered Naomi as someone who connected easily with people. She could hold a conversation without making it feel like an effort. There was an openness about her that encouraged trust, the kind of quality that cannot be measured in official documents but often defines how someone is remembered after they are gone. People who possess that warmth rarely think of it as unusual. To them, friendliness is simply part of everyday life. That ordinary openness would later become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this story. Trust is one of the invisible threads holding communities together. Every day, strangers exchange polite conversations in cafes, pubs, supermarkets, and train stations. Most of those encounters begin and end without consequence. Society depends upon the assumption that ordinary human interaction is, by default, safe. If every conversation were approached with suspicion, everyday life would become impossible. Naomi lived according to that assumption because almost everyone does. There was nothing reckless about believing that an evening conversation could remain exactly what it appeared to be. There was nothing extraordinary about meeting someone in a familiar public place. Those were ordinary parts of social life in Winchester. Like many historic English cities, Winchester encouraged that sense of familiarity. Its streets were compact enough that people frequently encountered familiar faces. Local pubs served not only as places to eat or drink but as gathering points where conversations flowed naturally between people who had never met before. Visitors mixed easily with residents. The atmosphere encouraged openness rather than caution. For years, that openness had been one of the city's strengths. It reflected a community comfortable with itself. A place where daily life moved at a human pace rather than one dominated by fear. Naomi was part of that community. She lived inside its routines, shared its assumptions, and trusted the ordinary rhythm of the city around her. Looking back now, it is tempting to search for dramatic warning signs in her story, as though some hidden clue might explain what happened later. The historical record offers no such evidence. Nothing suggests that Naomi believed she faced unusual danger. Nothing indicates that she anticipated becoming part of a criminal investigation that would attract national attention. She expected tomorrow. That simple expectation may be the most relatable part of her story. Every evening, millions of people make plans for the following day without imagining that those plans will never be fulfilled. They think about work schedules, family responsibilities, errands that need completing, or conversations still waiting to happen. The future feels dependable because, most of the time, it is. That quiet confidence is one of life's greatest gifts. It also makes unexpected tragedy especially devastating. The days before August 17, 2005, passed much as countless other days had. Summer still lingered over Hampshire. The longer evenings encouraged people to remain outdoors, meeting friends after work or enjoying the warmth before autumn arrived. Winchester's streets reflected that seasonal rhythm. Restaurants remained busy. Local pubs welcomed familiar customers. Families enjoyed the final weeks before schools would soon return to their regular schedules. Within that ordinary setting, Naomi's life continued as it always had. There were responsibilities waiting at home. Relationships that mattered. Conversations yet to be had. The future remained open. It is worth pausing here because hindsight can quietly distort memory. Knowing the outcome encourages us to imagine that everything leading toward it carried hidden significance. In reality, life almost never feels that way while it is being lived. Most moments are simply moments. Most conversations are forgotten within days. Most evenings become indistinguishable from those that came before them. Only later do we assign meaning to ordinary events. Only later do we recognize that an everyday decision marked the beginning of something irreversible. For Naomi's daughter, the world still possessed the reassuring predictability that every young person deserves. A parent was supposed to come home. A familiar voice was supposed to fill the house. Tomorrow was supposed to resemble yesterday. No official inquiry can truly measure what it means when that certainty disappears. The legal system can identify responsibility. Courts can impose punishment. Governments can review procedures. But none of those actions can restore the ordinary life that existed before loss entered a family. That is why Naomi Bryant's story deserves to be told with care. Not because of the violence that ended her life, but because of the life that existed before violence interrupted it. She was more than a case number. More than a newspaper headline. More than the central figure in a national debate about criminal justice. She was a person whose place in the world mattered deeply to those who knew her. A mother whose daughter expected another ordinary evening together. A woman whose future was still unfolding. As this story continues, the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the institutional failures will inevitably occupy much of our attention. They are essential to understanding why this case became one of the most consequential criminal justice controversies in modern Britain. But those developments should never overshadow the simple truth at the heart of the story. Everything that followed began with the loss of one human life. Every report written afterward. Every policy reconsidered. Every question asked in court. Every reform debated by officials. All of it traces back to one ordinary woman whose life had value long before the world learned her name. Remembering that truth is not simply an act of respect, it is the only way to ensure that Naomi Bryant remains the center of her own story, rather than becoming a footnote in someone else's. Before Naomi Bryant became the subject of national headlines, she was simply part of the fabric of everyday life in Winchester. Her story did not begin with a crime scene, an investigation, or a courtroom. It began years earlier in the ordinary spaces where most human stories are created: homes, workplaces, friendships, and family relationships. The tragedy that followed would eventually cause strangers across Britain to learn her name. But those closest to Naomi had known her long before the public ever heard about her. They knew the person behind the headlines. They knew the woman who laughed, who worried, who cared, who made plans, and who played a familiar role in the lives of the people around her. That distinction matters. In the aftermath of a serious crime, attention naturally turns toward the person responsible. The offender becomes the focus of investigations, documentaries, and public discussion. Their history is examined in detail. Their motives are analyzed. Their choices are debated. But behind every victim is a complete human life that existed before the moment that changed everything. Naomi Bryant's life was not defined by the final day she was seen alive. It was defined by everything that came before. She was a mother raising a teenage daughter, a role that shaped the way she moved through the world. Parents often measure time differently. Their days are not simply a sequence of hours, they are a collection of responsibilities, small concerns, and hopes for someone else's future. A parent's thoughts are frequently divided between the present and the years ahead. Will my child be happy? Will they be safe? Will they have opportunities? Will they know how much they are loved? These questions rarely appear in official records, but they are often the true story of family life. For Naomi, her daughter represented a connection to the future. Like many parents, she was not only living her own life but helping prepare another person for theirs. The conversations, encouragement, and support shared between them formed the foundation of a relationship that could not be replaced. When a parent is suddenly removed from a child's life, the loss is not limited to one moment. It changes every future moment. Birthdays arrive with someone missing. Important decisions are faced without familiar advice. Achievements are reached without the person who once imagined celebrating them. The grief is not only about what happened in the past. It is also about every future memory that will never exist. That is the hidden scale of loss. A single life contains thousands of possible future moments, and when that life ends, all of those possibilities disappear at once. Those who knew Naomi described a person who was approachable and comfortable around others. She had the qualities that allow people to feel at ease, an ability to communicate naturally, to form connections, and to become part of the communities around her. These qualities may appear simple, but they are often what makes someone memorable. People are not always remembered because they achieved something extraordinary. Often, they are remembered because of how they made others feel. A kind word during a difficult day. A willingness to listen. A familiar presence. A person who could be counted on. These are the details that remain when someone is gone. The human mind often tries to preserve people through small fragments of memory. A particular expression. A favorite phrase. A familiar habit. The way someone entered a room or reacted to a story. These details may seem insignificant from the outside, but to those who loved someone, they become priceless. They are evidence that a person existed beyond the circumstances of their death. Naomi lived within a community where relationships mattered. Winchester was a place where people often encountered familiar faces repeatedly. The city's smaller scale created connections between residents, businesses, and neighborhoods. People developed routines. They returned to familiar places. They built a sense of belonging. Communities like this are often held together by invisible relationships. A shopkeeper recognizing a regular customer. A neighbor asking how someone's family is doing. Friends meeting in the same places week after week. Those interactions create a feeling of security. They remind people that they are not anonymous. Naomi was part of that network. She was not a stranger passing through a city that meant nothing to her. She was someone with a place within the community, someone whose absence would later be felt by people who had shared parts of their lives with her. That is one of the most painful aspects of unexpected loss. The world outside the family continues moving. Cars still travel down the same roads. Shops still open their doors. People still gather in familiar places. The physical world remains almost unchanged, while one family's entire reality has been transformed. For those left behind, ordinary locations become reminders. A street where someone once walked. A place where conversations once happened. A routine that will never feel the same again. This is how tragedy reshapes memory. It does not erase the past. Instead, it changes the meaning of places and moments that once felt ordinary. The story of Naomi Bryant also raises an important question about how society remembers victims of crime. Too often, victims become known only through the circumstances surrounding their deaths. Their identities become connected to what happened to them rather than who they were. But Naomi was not simply the victim in a criminal case. She was a person with experiences, relationships, and a history that existed independently of the tragedy. A responsible telling of this story requires remembering that distinction. The investigation into her death would eventually reveal serious questions about the management of dangerous offenders. The court case would establish criminal responsibility. Public inquiries would examine institutional decisions. But before any of those questions existed, there was Naomi. A woman living her life. A mother caring for her daughter. A person whose future still contained unwritten chapters. The importance of remembering her life becomes even clearer when considering what happened afterward. As public discussion focused on Anthony Rice and the failures surrounding his release, there was a risk that Naomi's own story could become overshadowed. The offender's history was extensive. The institutional failures were significant. The consequences for criminal justice policy were far-reaching. But none of those subjects should replace the central truth that a family lost someone irreplaceable. Every major investigation eventually creates documents. Every trial creates transcripts. Every public inquiry creates reports. These records are necessary because societies need to understand what happened and why. Yet documents cannot fully capture a person's importance. A report may describe age, relationships, and circumstances. It cannot describe the feeling of someone's presence. It cannot measure the comfort they provided. It cannot record every small kindness that made them loved. That part of Naomi's story belongs to the people who knew her. And perhaps that is the most meaningful way to understand her. Not through the moment when her life ended, but through the years when she was living it. The tragedy that followed would lead to questions about justice, responsibility, and public safety. It would challenge assumptions about how dangerous offenders are managed. It would influence conversations far beyond Winchester. But beneath all those discussions remained a simple human reality. A daughter lost her mother. A family lost someone they loved. A community lost a familiar presence. And a woman who had spent 40 years building a life of connections became remembered by millions who never had the chance to know her. The purpose of telling Naomi Bryant's story is not to focus only on how she died. It is to remember that before she became part of a national conversation, she was already someone who mattered. She had a life. She had relationships. She had a place in the world. And that life deserves to be remembered in its own right. Naomi Bryant's story, like every person's story, was much larger than the event that brought her name into public attention. The tragedy that followed would eventually lead to investigations, legal proceedings, and national debate, but before any of that existed, there was a woman living an ordinary life filled with the same hopes, concerns, and responsibilities shared by millions of people. The difficulty with cases like this is that the public often meets victims at the end of their stories. A photograph appears in the news. A name becomes connected to a terrible event. A person who was once known only to family and friends suddenly becomes recognized by strangers. But that public image is incomplete. A life cannot be understood through the final chapter alone. Naomi Bryant had spent 40 years creating memories, building relationships, and becoming part of the lives of the people around her. Those years contained thousands of moments that would never appear in official records. They existed only in the memories of those who loved her. A conversation shared at the right moment. A laugh that made an ordinary day better. A familiar routine that seemed too normal to notice. The small details that make a person feel irreplaceable. These are often the things families miss most after sudden loss. Not only the major milestones. Not only the celebrations. But the everyday presence. The person who was always there. The voice from another room. The familiar questions asked without thinking. The comfort of knowing someone would answer when you called. For Naomi's daughter, that presence was part of the foundation of life. A parent often becomes part of the invisible structure holding a family together. Their support may not always be noticed because it is constant. It exists in the background, quietly shaping confidence, security, and identity. When that person is suddenly gone, the absence is not limited to one painful moment. It appears again and again. At important events. During difficult decisions. In moments when a child instinctively wants to turn to the person who is no longer there. That is why the consequences of violent crime extend far beyond the immediate event. The damage spreads through families and communities, affecting people who were never present when the crime occurred but who must live with its consequences afterward. Naomi's life before the tragedy was not defined by fear. Like most people, she moved through the world believing that ordinary interactions would remain ordinary. She participated in the routines of daily life with the same basic trust that allows society to function. That trust is easy to overlook because it is so deeply embedded in human behavior. Every day, people speak with strangers. They meet new people. They accept invitations. They share conversations in public places. Most of these moments are harmless. Most lead nowhere significant. They become forgotten pieces of everyday experience. The ability to interact openly with others is one of the things that makes communities possible. Naomi lived within that reality. She was part of a world where people still greeted one another, where familiar places created a sense of comfort, and where the assumption of normal human decency shaped everyday decisions. The later revelation of Anthony Rice's history would transform how many people viewed that assumption. It would lead to difficult discussions about risk, responsibility, and whether the systems designed to protect the public had failed. But it is important to separate those later questions from Naomi herself. She did not enter this story because of who she was. She entered it because of what was done to her. Her life had meaning before the investigation began. It had meaning before courts examined evidence. It had meaning before officials reviewed paperwork and answered questions about their decisions. Remembering that is essential because victims can easily become overshadowed by the systems and offenders surrounding their cases. The offender's history may be complicated. The investigation may be extensive. The legal arguments may last for years. But the person at the center of the loss remains a human being whose future was taken away. Naomi Bryant was a mother who should have continued watching her daughter grow older. She was someone who should have experienced future birthdays, conversations, and ordinary days that families often assume will always be available. Those unwritten moments are part of every life. They represent everything a person still had ahead of them. When someone dies unexpectedly, the loss is not only of the past. It is also the loss of a future that can no longer happen. A future where Naomi might have offered advice. A future where she might have celebrated achievements. A future where she might have grown older alongside the people she loved. Those possibilities disappeared in a single event. And that is why the human impact of this case cannot be measured only through legal outcomes. A conviction can establish accountability. A sentence can recognize wrongdoing. A public inquiry can identify failures. But none of those things can restore the future that was lost. The community around Naomi would eventually face its own form of grief. Places that once felt familiar could carry new meanings. Conversations that once seemed ordinary could become memories. People who had known her casually might find themselves remembering small interactions they never expected to become important. This is how communities experience tragedy. Not only through what they see in the news, but through the quiet changes that follow. A familiar name missing from conversations. A person no longer appearing in places where they once belonged. A reminder that every individual is connected to others in ways that are often invisible until those connections are broken. As the investigation into Naomi's death unfolded, public attention naturally turned toward Anthony Rice and the decisions that allowed him to be living in the community at that time. Those questions were necessary. They revealed serious concerns about how dangerous offenders were assessed and supervised. But even while those questions were being asked, Naomi's identity needed to remain separate from the controversy surrounding her death. She was not simply evidence in a case. She was not simply a symbol of institutional failure. She was Naomi Bryant. A woman whose life had value independent of what happened to her. A mother whose importance could not be measured by the attention that followed her death. A person remembered by those who knew her not because of tragedy, but because of the relationship they shared with her. The most respectful way to tell this story is to begin there. Not with the investigation. Not with the offender. Not with the failures that would later be exposed. But with the understanding that before a crime creates a case file, it creates a wound. Before a courtroom hears testimony, a family experiences loss. Before a nation debates policy, one person's world has already changed forever. Naomi Bryant's story is therefore not only about the circumstances that ended her life. It is about the life that existed before those circumstances. It is about the person behind the headlines and the reminder that every victim of crime was once simply someone living, loving, planning, and looking toward the future. A future Naomi deserved to have. A future her family deserved to share with her. And a future that, after August 2005, could only exist in memory. August 17, 2005, began like many other summer days in Winchester. There was no indication that the evening would become a defining moment in the history of the city. No one walking through the familiar streets could have known that, by the following morning, a family would be facing unimaginable grief and a nation would be asking difficult questions about how such a tragedy could have occurred. For most people, that day existed in the same ordinary rhythm as countless others. Work ended. Shops closed. People made plans for the evening. The last warmth of summer remained in the air as residents moved through the city's familiar streets, carrying on with routines that had been repeated many times before. For Naomi Bryant, the evening represented something equally ordinary, time spent outside the structure of daily responsibilities. Like many adults, she entered the evening without expecting anything unusual. There was no reason to believe that a normal social interaction would later become the focus of a major criminal investigation. That is one of the most unsettling elements of this case. The beginning did not look like the beginning of a tragedy. It looked like an ordinary human encounter. Naomi met Anthony Rice at a pub in Winchester. At that moment, he was not a name known nationally. He was not yet the central figure in a case that would trigger public outrage and government scrutiny. To those around him, he appeared as another person in a public place, someone participating in a normal social environment. But beneath that ordinary appearance was a history that stretched back decades. Anthony Rice was not an individual without a past. His background was already known to authorities. Years before that night, his behavior had placed him within the criminal justice system repeatedly. His record included serious offenses involving violence against women, and professionals had spent years assessing the risks associated with his release. The public, however, did not know that history. The people around him did not see the reports, the assessments, or the warnings contained within official records. They saw only the person standing in front of them. That gap between appearance and reality would become one of the central themes of the case. As the evening continued, Naomi and Rice spoke. Like countless conversations that happen every day in pubs across Britain, it was an interaction between two people who had not known each other before that moment. There was no visible sign that the conversation would later become part of a police investigation. According to evidence presented later in court, the two eventually left the pub together. The journey that followed would later be examined carefully by investigators. Every detail became significant because investigators were attempting to understand not only what happened, but when the situation changed from ordinary interaction into a fatal sequence of events. Rice later provided his own account of what happened during that period. His explanation focused on a perceived personal slight and an emotional reaction that he claimed occurred while they were walking. Investigators and prosecutors examined his statements alongside other evidence, seeking to understand his actions and motivations. But one fact remained central throughout the case. The responsibility belonged entirely to the person who chose violence. Naomi had not caused what happened. She had not created the circumstances. She had simply gone through an ordinary evening believing she was safe. This distinction became particularly important as the case unfolded. In many investigations involving violence against women, there is a harmful tendency to examine the victim's choices rather than the offender's decisions. Questions are sometimes directed toward where someone went, who they spoke with, or why they trusted another person. But the central question should always remain. Why did the offender choose to harm another person? Anthony Rice's history showed that the violence was not an unexplained moment appearing from nowhere. It was connected to patterns of behavior that had existed long before Naomi Bryant entered his life. That history would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation. For now, however, the focus remained on reconstructing the final known movements of Naomi's life. When the two arrived at Naomi's home, investigators believed the situation changed dramatically. What had begun as a social encounter became a crime scene. The details that emerged afterwards shocked the community. The person Naomi had spent part of her evening with was not a stranger with no warning signs in his past. He was someone whose previous convictions and risk assessments would later become the center of national criticism. The tragedy was not only that violence occurred. It was that the person responsible had already been known as dangerous. That fact changed the way people understood the case. If the offender had been unknown, the public reaction would have focused primarily on the crime itself. But Anthony Rice's background introduced another layer of horror. People wanted to know how someone with such a serious history had been allowed to live in the community. How had the system evaluated the danger he represented? Why had previous warnings not prevented what happened? Those questions would eventually dominate the aftermath. But on the night itself, there was only the immediate tragedy. A family member would soon be searching for answers. A community would soon wake to devastating news. And investigators would soon begin piecing together what had happened inside a home that should have represented safety. The transition from an ordinary evening to a national case happened with frightening speed. One moment, Naomi was part of the everyday life of Winchester. The next, her absence would become impossible to explain. Her family would experience the kind of loss that changes the meaning of time itself. The past becomes filled with memories, while the future becomes defined by everything that will no longer happen. For investigators, the challenge was to understand the sequence of events and establish responsibility. For the public, the challenge was to understand something even more disturbing. How could this happen when the warning signs surrounding Anthony Rice had existed for so many years? That question would follow the case from the first investigation through the courtroom and into the government reviews that came afterward. The crime itself was the beginning of the public story. But the deeper story was already waiting behind it. A story about decisions. A story about accountability. A story about whether institutions designed to protect society had failed at the moment when protection mattered most. As August 17, 2005, came to an end, Winchester remained unaware of the tragedy unfolding within its streets. The city continued its ordinary routines. Lights went out in homes. People prepared for another day. Families settled into the quiet of the evening. But for Naomi Bryant and those who loved her, the world had already changed forever. And in the days that followed, the search for answers would reveal that the events of one night were connected to a much longer history, one that began years before Naomi ever met Anthony Rice. The most difficult moments to understand in any criminal case are often not the moments themselves, but the transition between what seemed ordinary and what became irreversible. Before tragedy enters a story, there is usually a period of normality. People are talking, moving, making decisions, following routines. Nothing appears different from any other day. Then, somewhere along the way, a line is crossed. A choice is made. A situation changes. And afterward, everyone looks back searching for the exact moment when everything began to go wrong. The case of Naomi Bryant carries that painful uncertainty. The evening of August 17, 2005, did not begin as a dramatic confrontation. It began as a social encounter in a familiar place. A pub in Winchester. A public setting. Other people nearby. The kind of environment where most people naturally lower their guard because they believe they are surrounded by ordinary human interaction. That belief is one of the foundations of everyday life. People meet. People talk. People form impressions. Most of the time, those impressions are accurate enough to allow society to function. But sometimes, appearances hide realities that others cannot see. Anthony Rice entered that evening carrying a history that was invisible to those around him. The people who encountered him did not know the details contained within his criminal record. They did not know the years of previous offending that had shaped how professionals viewed him. They did not know the internal discussions that had taken place about whether he could safely return to the community. They saw only what was visible. And what was visible did not reveal the danger that existed beneath the surface. That contrast would become one of the defining elements of the case. A person with a deeply troubling past moving through an ordinary community. A woman living an ordinary evening. A system that had decided the risk could be managed. 3 different realities existing at the same time. Only afterward would they be connected. As Naomi and Rice spent time together that evening, there was no public indication that anything extraordinary was happening. The people around them could not know that the interaction would later become a subject of police reconstruction and courtroom examination. This is one of the challenges investigators face in cases like this. The moments before a crime often look meaningless while they are happening. A conversation is simply a conversation. A decision is simply a decision. A person leaving one place and traveling to another appears no different from thousands of similar movements taking place across the country. Only after tragedy occurs do those moments become important. Investigators then work backward. They examine timelines. They speak with witnesses. They review available evidence. They attempt to understand how a sequence of ordinary events led to an extraordinary outcome. In Naomi Bryant's case, that process would reveal a disturbing pattern. The crime was not the product of a sudden unknown danger appearing from nowhere. It involved an individual whose capacity for serious harm had already been documented over many years. That fact would become impossible to ignore. The court would later hear details about Anthony Rice's past and the decisions that allowed him to be living in the community. The public would learn that concerns about him had existed long before Naomi Bryant became connected to his story. But at the time of their meeting, Naomi did not have access to those records. She did not know what officials knew. She did not have the information contained in confidential assessments. She interacted with another person based on the information available to her in that moment. And that is an important point in understanding this case. The responsibility for violence always belongs to the person who commits it. The existence of trust does not create responsibility for someone else's actions. The failure was not that Naomi treated another person as human. The failure was that a person who had repeatedly demonstrated dangerous behavior was placed in circumstances where another person became vulnerable. As the evening progressed, the two eventually left the pub together. According to statements later provided by Rice, he described a moment during their journey when he interpreted Naomi's actions in a particular way and claimed that it influenced his behavior. His explanation would later be examined in court. But explanations are not justifications. A person's interpretation of an event does not excuse the decision to harm another human being. That distinction was central to the prosecution's case and to the wider public discussion that followed. Many violent crimes involve attempts by offenders to create a story around their actions. They describe emotions, circumstances, or perceived triggers. They present a version of events that shifts attention toward what happened around them rather than the choices they themselves made. But accountability requires looking clearly at those choices. Anthony Rice had a history. He had made decisions before. He had caused harm before. The events of August 17, 2005, could not be understood as a completely isolated moment disconnected from everything that came earlier. The deeper question was not simply what happened that night. It was why someone with such a documented history had been placed back into ordinary society. That question would eventually move beyond the courtroom. It would enter government investigations and public debate. But before those discussions began, there was the immediate reality of a family waiting for Naomi to return. There is a particular cruelty in cases where a person disappears from everyday life without warning. The world around them continues as normal. Phones remain silent. Messages remain unanswered. Plans remain incomplete. At first, people often search for ordinary explanations. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Perhaps someone is delayed. Perhaps there is a simple reason that will soon become clear. The mind naturally resists accepting the possibility of something terrible. That resistance is part of being human. Families are not prepared to immediately imagine the worst. They hold on to normal explanations because normal explanations are what life usually provides. But eventually, questions become impossible to ignore. The absence becomes frightening. The search for answers begins. And for Naomi's loved ones, the discovery that something was terribly wrong would begin a journey they never expected to take. A journey through police interviews, court proceedings, media attention, and years of trying to understand how such a tragedy could occur. The events of that evening would eventually be reconstructed in detail by investigators. But for Naomi's family, the details could never change the most important fact. Someone they loved was gone. Everything else, the investigation, the trial, the inquiries, came afterward. That is often forgotten when society examines a major criminal case. The public sees the investigation. The media reports the controversy. The courts determine responsibility. But families experience something much more personal. They experience the empty space left behind. They experience the permanent absence of someone who should still be there. As the night of August 17th drew to a close, Winchester remained unaware of what had happened. The city slept. Homes grew quiet. Streetlights continued shining over familiar roads. For most residents, morning would bring another ordinary day. For Naomi Bryant's family, morning would bring a reality that could never be undone. And for Britain's criminal justice system, it would eventually bring a reckoning. Because the tragedy that unfolded that night was not only about one violent act. It was about a much longer chain of decisions that stretched back years. The story of Naomi Bryant's final evening would become inseparable from the story of Anthony Rice's past, the assessments made about him, and the safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. The investigation would soon begin. The questions would soon follow. And one of the most important criminal justice debates in modern Britain would emerge from the silence left behind by a single night in Winchester. In the aftermath of a tragedy, people often search for a single moment that explains everything. They want to find the turning point. The exact second when an ordinary day became something else. They want a clear boundary between before and after. But real events rarely unfold that neatly. A life-changing event is usually not recognized while it is happening. The people involved do not know they are standing inside a moment that will later be examined by investigators, debated by lawyers, and remembered years afterward. They are simply moving through time, making decisions based on what they understand at that moment. That was true for Naomi Bryant. On the evening of August 17, 2005, she was not entering a story that would later dominate national headlines. She was not aware that her name would become connected to discussions about criminal justice, risk assessment, and institutional responsibility. She was simply living through another summer evening in Winchester. That ordinary reality is important because it reminds us who Naomi was before the tragedy. She was not a symbol. She was not a headline. She was a person. A mother. A woman with relationships, memories, and a future that still seemed open. The events that followed would later be studied in detail, but no investigation could ever fully capture what existed before that night. No timeline could measure the value of the life that was interrupted. No court document could contain the full meaning of what Naomi represented to the people who loved her. As investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events, one fact became increasingly clear: the danger surrounding Anthony Rice was not something that appeared suddenly on that evening. It had a history. For years, Anthony Rice had been known to the criminal justice system. His previous convictions had created a record that professionals were required to consider when making decisions about his future. His behavior had been examined through reports and assessments designed to evaluate whether he could safely live outside prison. Those decisions existed long before Naomi Bryant ever encountered him. That is what made the case so deeply disturbing. The tragedy was not simply that a dangerous person committed a crime. It was that the danger had already been documented. The public reaction after Naomi's death was shaped by that knowledge. People struggled to understand how a man with such a serious background had been allowed to live in the community. They questioned whether enough had been done to protect potential victims. They asked whether the system had placed too much confidence in the possibility of rehabilitation and too little emphasis on the risks that remained. Those questions would eventually lead to official reviews. But before the policy debates and public inquiries, there was the immediate reality of a missing person, a worried family, and a community beginning to understand that something terrible had happened. The first moments after a person disappears are often filled with uncertainty. Families rarely begin with the assumption that the worst has occurred. They search for explanations that preserve hope. Perhaps there has been a delay. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Perhaps there is a simple reason that will soon be discovered. Hope can be powerful because it protects people from accepting unbearable possibilities too quickly. But investigations begin when uncertainty can no longer remain unanswered. Police officers begin gathering information. Witnesses are contacted. Movements are reconstructed. Small details become significant. A conversation that seemed unimportant becomes a piece of a timeline. A location that seemed ordinary becomes part of an investigation. A person who was previously unknown becomes central to understanding what happened. In Naomi Bryant's case, investigators quickly focused on the circumstances surrounding her final known movements. The work was not only about determining what happened, but also about understanding how the events unfolded and identifying the person responsible. The investigation would soon reveal that Anthony Rice was not an unknown offender who had managed to avoid detection. His history was already extensive. His name existed in records long before it appeared in connection with Naomi Bryant's death. That discovery changed the nature of the case. It transformed public concern into public anger. Many criminal cases create fear because they reveal the presence of danger. This case created something different. It revealed that the danger had been recognized before. The question became whether recognition had been enough. The criminal justice system often operates in the space between uncertainty and responsibility. Professionals must make decisions about people whose futures cannot be predicted with complete accuracy. They rely on assessments, evidence, and experience. They attempt to balance competing principles. But the consequences of a mistake are not equal. For the person released, a wrong decision may mean freedom. For the public, a wrong decision may mean unimaginable harm. The case of Anthony Rice forced Britain to examine that imbalance. It challenged the assumption that procedures alone guarantee safety. It showed that even systems built around careful evaluation can fail when warnings are misunderstood, communication breaks down, or risks are underestimated. Yet amid those larger questions, the personal tragedy remained. For Naomi's daughter and family, the debate about policy could never replace the person they had lost. Public discussions might focus on statistics, procedures, and institutional responsibility. A family experienced something far more immediate. They experienced absence. The missing conversations. The empty spaces. The future moments that would never happen. This is the human reality behind every major criminal case. Before there is a trial, there is a loss. Before there is a report, there is a family trying to understand. Before there is a national conversation, there is one person whose life has been changed forever. The story of Naomi Bryant's final evening therefore cannot be separated from the larger questions that followed, but neither can it be reduced to them. The failures that would later be identified matter because they explain how such a tragedy became possible. But Naomi matters because she was the reason those questions needed to be asked. Her life represented everything that was lost. Her family represented everyone who continued living with the consequences. And the investigation that followed would become an attempt not only to establish what happened, but to understand why the protections designed to prevent it had not been enough. In the days after August 17, Winchester would begin to move from shock toward investigation. The quiet streets that had always represented safety would become associated with one of the most controversial criminal justice cases in Britain. The name Anthony Rice would become known across the country. But before that name dominated headlines, there was another name that deserved to remain at the center of the story. Naomi Bryant. Because long after investigations end and public attention moves elsewhere, the most important truth remains unchanged. A person was lost. A family was changed forever. And a community was left searching for answers to a question that should never have needed to be asked. The first signs that something was terribly wrong did not arrive with certainty. They arrived with concern. With unanswered questions. With the uneasy feeling that something ordinary had somehow become impossible to explain. For families experiencing a sudden disappearance or unexpected absence, the mind often moves through a series of explanations before accepting the possibility of something more serious. A delayed journey. A forgotten phone call. An unexpected change of plans. Human beings naturally search for ordinary answers because ordinary answers are what life usually provides. But sometimes, ordinary explanations begin to disappear one by one. And what remains is a silence that becomes impossible to ignore. For Naomi Bryant's family, that silence marked the beginning of a nightmare that would forever divide their lives into two parts: the time before they knew something was wrong, and everything that came afterward. Before the investigation began, before police officers entered the case, before newspapers across Britain began reporting on the tragedy, there was simply a family waiting for someone they loved to return. That waiting is one of the most difficult experiences to understand from the outside. To strangers, a missing person case may appear to begin when authorities become involved. But for families, the investigation starts much earlier. It begins in the private moments when concern slowly replaces routine. A phone that does not receive an answer. A message that remains unread. A person who is not where they are expected to be. At first, people resist fear. They tell themselves there must be another explanation. They hold on to normal possibilities because accepting the alternative feels impossible. For Naomi's daughter and those close to her, the realization that something was seriously wrong would come gradually but painfully. The person they expected to see again was not returning. The familiar routines of everyday life had been interrupted. And the questions that followed had no comforting answers. When police become involved in a case like this, their first responsibility is to establish facts. Before conclusions can be reached, investigators must reconstruct events. They must determine movements, identify witnesses, gather information, and understand the circumstances surrounding the disappearance. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. The first challenge is separating what is known from what is assumed. Who was the last person to see the missing individual? Where were they last known to be? What interactions occurred before they disappeared? What information can be confirmed? These questions may sound simple, but answering them requires careful attention to detail. A single conversation, a single location, or a single timeline entry can become significant when investigators are trying to understand what happened. In Naomi Bryant's case, the investigation quickly moved toward reconstructing her final known movements. The focus was not only on where she had been, but on who she had been with. Anthony Rice became central to that investigation. As officers examined his background, they discovered something that would change the nature of the case completely. The man connected to Naomi's disappearance was not someone with no history. He was someone whose past was already known to authorities. The revelation was shocking because it introduced a second layer of questions. A traditional homicide investigation asks, who committed this crime? Why did they do it? What evidence proves responsibility? But this case demanded additional questions. How was this person living in the community? Who had assessed the risk he represented? What decisions had been made before Naomi ever met him? Those questions would eventually become the foundation of a much larger examination of the criminal justice system. But at the beginning of the investigation, police had a more immediate task. They needed to determine the truth of what had happened. Investigators worked to piece together the timeline surrounding Naomi's final hours. They examined witness accounts and available evidence. They looked for inconsistencies, connections, and information that could explain how an ordinary evening had ended in tragedy. The process of investigation is often less dramatic than portrayed in films. It is not a single moment when every answer suddenly appears. Instead, it is a gradual process of assembling fragments. A statement from one person. A record from another source. A detail that seems insignificant until placed beside something else. Piece by piece, investigators create a picture of events. In serious criminal cases, the truth is rarely found in one piece of evidence alone. It emerges from the connection between many pieces. As the investigation developed, the public began learning more about Anthony Rice's background. The details raised immediate concerns because they suggested that the tragedy was connected not only to one individual's actions but also to a broader failure of judgment. For many people following the case, the most disturbing question was not whether Rice had committed the crime. The evidence would eventually establish that. The deeper question was how the opportunity had existed. How had a person with such a documented history been returned to society? How had the safeguards intended to manage that risk failed? Those questions transformed public reaction. People were no longer only grieving with Naomi's family. They were questioning a system they believed existed to protect them. The discovery of Naomi's death became the beginning of two parallel investigations. The first was the criminal investigation. Police sought evidence, established responsibility, and prepared the case for court. The second was a wider examination of institutional decisions. Government agencies, probation services, and justice officials would later face scrutiny over the choices made before the tragedy occurred. The first investigation asked, what happened to Naomi Bryant? The second asked, why was it possible for it to happen? Both questions were necessary. Both carried enormous consequences. For Naomi's family, however, no investigation could change the central reality. The person they loved was gone. The legal process could identify what happened. The courts could deliver a sentence. The government could review procedures. But none of those actions could restore the ordinary future they had expected. This is the painful reality behind every major criminal investigation. Evidence can explain events. It cannot undo them. Reports can identify failures. They cannot repair the emotional damage left behind. As Winchester moved from shock into investigation, the city began to understand that this was not simply a local tragedy. The circumstances surrounding Naomi Bryant's death reached far beyond one home and one offender. They raised questions about the responsibilities of institutions, the limits of risk assessment, and the consequences of decisions made long before the public knew anything was wrong. The quiet streets of Winchester had become the starting point of a national conversation. But before the debates began, before officials responded, before reforms were discussed, there was the work of uncovering the truth. Investigators had to follow the evidence. They had to reconstruct the final chapter of Naomi Bryant's life. And they had to answer the first question that every victim's family deserves to have answered. What happened?